He set up the tree now? Please? The next hour was filled with activity as they found a place for the small tree in the corner of the living room, strung the lights, and hung the ornaments. Sophie insisted that the paper decorations she and her mom had made should be included, a touch that made the tree look more special than any professionally decorated one Thomas had ever had. "It's perfect," Sophie declared when they finished, standing back to admire their work. "Almost perfect," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small star tree topper he'd grabbed at the last minute. "Every tree needs a star on top." He lifted Sophie up so she could place the star herself, her face glowing with pride when it was positioned just right. As Kelly returned to the kitchen to check on their meal, Thomas found himself looking around the small apartment with new eyes. The furniture was worn but tidy, the decorations simple but made with care. Photos of Sophie at various ages lined one wall, showing her growth from baby to the little girl who had changed his life in less than a day. "Do you want to see my room?" Sophie asked, pulling him by the hand without waiting for an answer. Her bedroom was tiny, with just enough space for a twin bed, a small dresser, and a bookshelf filled with library books. The walls were decorated with her own artwork, drawings of animals, people, and imaginative scenes. Mr. Floppy sat in a place of honor on her pillow. "This is my favorite book," Sophie said, pulling a worn copy of a children's story from her shelf. "Mom reads it to me every Christmas Eve." "Not last night," Thomas pointed out gently. "That's okay. We had a special Christmas Eve anyway," Sophie said. Then she lowered her voice to a whisper. "Mom says you're rich and important and probably super busy, so it was extra nice of you to help me." Thomas knelt down to her level. "Meeting you was the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time, Sophie," she beamed at him. "I'm glad you got lost in the park." "Me too," Thomas said, realizing he meant it completely. "Dinner's ready," Kelly called from the kitchen. The meal was exactly as Sophie had described: macaroni and cheese with pasta shapes like trees and stars, along with green beans and rolls. It was simpler than anything Thomas had eaten at Christmas in decades, yet somehow more satisfying. "This is delicious," he said after his first bite, and Kelly's relieved smile told him she'd been nervous about serving such a simple meal to a billionaire. They talked easily throughout dinner. Kelly told stories about Sophie as a baby, and Sophie shared her plans to become a doctor and maybe fix broken hearts, the real kind and the sad kind too. Thomas found himself talking more openly than he had in years, telling them about his own childhood, his early days building his business, and even about his estranged son, David. "You should call him," Sophie said, echoing her advice from the day before. "I think I will," Thomas said. "Tomorrow." After dinner, Sophie opened her presents, her excitement over the doctor kit bringing a lump to Thomas's throat. The new rabbit, which she immediately named Dr. Floppy, was declared Mr. Floppy's brother from another mother. As the short winter day faded to evening, Thomas realized he needed to go. He had taken up enough of their Christmas, yet he found himself reluctant to leave the warm little apartment with its paper chains and mismatched dishes. "I should be heading home," he finally said, as Sophie yawned despite her protest that she wasn't tired. "Thank you for coming," Kelly said, walking him to the door. It meant a lot to Sophie. "It meant more to me than I can express," Thomas replied honestly. As he put on his coat, Thomas found himself saying, "I've been thinking, your apartment building is owned by my company." Kelly's expression became guarded. "Yes, I know. The units could use updating, better heating systems, new appliances, maybe a community room for the children." Kelly looked surprised. "That would be wonderful, but—" "And the hospital," Thomas continued. "We should improve the staff facilities, proper break rooms, maybe an on-site childcare center for employees working odd shifts." "Mr. Pierce," "Thomas, you don't have to—" "I want to," he said firmly. "It's not charity, it's just the right thing to do." Kelly studied his face, then nodded slowly. "That would make a difference for a lot of families like ours." "Good," Thomas said. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Call my office next week. I'd like to hear your ideas on what would help most." As he turned to leave, Sophie ran up and hugged him around the waist. "Will you come back and visit us?" Thomas looked down at her hopeful face, then at Kelly, who gave a small nod. "How about dinner next Sunday?" he suggested. "I know a great pizza place." Sophie's face lit up. "With extra cheese?" "Definitely with extra cheese." Outside, the city was dark except for the colored lights of Christmas decorations glowing in windows. Thomas's driver was waiting patiently, the car's engine running. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked as Thomas settled in the back seat. Thomas looked back at the apartment building, where Sophie was waving from their third-floor window. "Home," he said. But for the first time in years, the word felt different on his lips. It felt like it might actually mean something again someday. As the car pulled away, Thomas took out his phone and found his son's number. It was still early on the West Coast. "Merry Christmas, David," he typed. "I'd like to talk if you're willing. I've learned some important lessons from a 7-year-old girl, and I'd like to share them with you." Thomas hit send, not knowing if his son would respond, but feeling more hopeful than he had in decades. A life could change in a single day. Thomas Pierce, billionaire businessman, had found something no amount of money could buy, a chance to become human again, all because a little girl had asked him to Christmas dinner. Then any deal he'd ever closed? "I'm sorry," he finally managed, his voice rough. "I'm not sad. It's been a long time since anyone invited me to Christmas dinner." To his surprise, Sophie got up from her chair, came around the table and wrapped her small arms around him in a hug. The gesture, so natural and genuine, only made Thomas cry harder. "Don't be sad," Sophie said, patting his back awkwardly. "Mom says it's okay to cry sometimes, but you don't have to be sad on Christmas." Thomas wiped at his eyes, trying to regain his composure. "I'm not sad," he said again. "Sometimes people cry when they remember things they've forgotten." Sophie nodded as if this made perfect sense. "So will you come? For Christmas dinner?" Thomas looked at this remarkable child who had somehow wandered into his life on Christmas Eve and changed everything in just a few hours. "I would be honored," he said sincerely. Sophie beamed. "Great, you can have the blue plate. That's the special guest plate." A nurse stopped by their table, looking concerned. "Is everything all right here?" Thomas quickly wiped his face. "Yes, everything's fine. We were just discussing Christmas plans." The nurse smiled uncertainly and continued on her way. Thomas could only imagine how strange they must look. A grown man in an expensive suit crying in a hospital cafeteria, while a little girl in a worn pink coat comforted him. Sophie returned to her seat and pushed her drawing across the table. "This is for you," she said. "So you remember to come tomorrow." Thomas looked down at the colorful drawing, a Christmas tree with 4 figures standing beside it, holding hands. A family. "Thank you, Sophie," he said, carefully folding the drawing and placing it in his coat pocket. "This might be the best Christmas present I've ever received." And to his surprise, he meant it. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed during the night. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow that blanketed the city, transforming even the dullest streets into something magical. Thomas stood in his penthouse, looking out over the white landscape. He'd barely slept after returning home at nearly 1 in the morning. His mind kept replaying the events of Christmas Eve, finding Sophie in the park, their impromptu dinner in the hospital cafeteria, and most of all, the moment when her simple invitation had broken through decades of emotional walls. Kelly had been surprised when he'd accepted Sophie's dinner invitation, but she hadn't objected. She'd written their address on a cafeteria napkin along with the time, 2 p.m., if you really want to come. Now Thomas checked his watch, 10:30 a.m. He had hours yet, but he felt strangely nervous. What should he bring? Wine seemed inappropriate for a family with a child. Flowers, dessert? What was the protocol for joining a nurse's aide and her daughter for Christmas dinner in their small apartment? His phone rang, Walter again. Thomas had turned it back on this morning to a flood of messages. The Singapore officials had accepted the new terms with the affordable housing included. The deal was saved, though at a lower profit margin than originally planned. "Merry Christmas, Walter," Thomas answered. "Is everything all right?" Walter asked immediately. "You've never given away concessions like that before." Thomas looked out at the city below. thinking of the thousands of people living in buildings he owned, people like Kelly and Sophie. "Everything's fine," he said. "Better than fine, actually." "How's the family?" "The what?" Walter sounded confused by the personal question. "They're good. The kids are opening presents, and that's great. Enjoy your day off. We'll talk tomorrow." Thomas hung up, leaving Walter undoubtedly puzzled by his boss's uncharacteristic behavior. After a shower and some thought, Thomas decided on his course of action. He dressed in casual clothes, something he rarely wore, and called his driver. His first stop was a high-end grocery store that remained open on Christmas Day. He filled a cart with treats, a fancy chocolate cake, fresh fruit, artisan cheese, and several other items that caught his eye. At the last minute, he added a bottle of sparkling cider for toasting. Next, he directed the driver to a big box store on the edge of town. The place was surprisingly busy with last-minute shoppers. Thomas walked through the aisles, feeling out of place but determined. In the toy section, he found what he was looking for, a deluxe doctor's kit with real working stethoscope, plus several books about medicine for children. On impulse, he added a soft, high-quality stuffed rabbit that looked like a more elegant version of Mr. Floppy. As he waited in the checkout line, Thomas noticed a display of small Christmas trees, the last few left now half price. He grabbed one along with lights and a package of colorful ornaments. Back in the car, Thomas checked the address Kelly had given him. It was in a part of town he rarely visited, an older neighborhood with small apartment buildings and family-owned shops. As the car pulled up to the address, Thomas was struck by how ordinary the building looked. Red brick, 4 stories with narrow balconies and worn steps leading to the entrance. A building his company had owned for years, yet he'd never seen in person. "Wait here," he told the driver. "I may be a while." Arms full of bags and the small tree, Thomas climbed to the 3rd floor. Apartment 3B had a paper wreath on the door, clearly handmade with cutouts of small handprints painted green to look like a wreath. Thomas took a deep breath and knocked. Footsteps pattered on the other side, and then the door flew open to reveal Sophie in pajamas decorated with snowmen. "Mr. Thomas, you came," she squealed, bouncing with excitement. "I promised I would," Thomas said, smiling at her enthusiasm. Mom, he's here and he brought a tree." Kelly appeared behind her daughter, looking slightly flustered. She wore jeans and a red sweater, her curly hair pulled back from her face. "Mr. Pierce, come in," she said, stepping aside. "You didn't have to bring all this." "Please call me Thomas," he said, stepping into the small apartment. "And I wanted to." The apartment was tiny but clean and brightened by paper chains and construction paper snowflakes hanging from the ceiling. A small table was set with mismatched dishes, including one blue plate placed prominently at what was clearly meant to be the guest's spot. "You brought a tree?" Kelly asked, noticing the small pine. "Sophie mentioned you didn't have one this year," Thomas explained, suddenly worried he'd overstepped. "I thought we could set it up together if that's okay." Sophie was already digging through the bags. "Look, Mom, ornaments. And presents." She pulled out the wrapped doctor kit. "Is this for me?" "Sophie," Kelly said with gentle warning in her voice. "Don't be nosy. It's fine," Thomas assured her. "And yes, those are for you, Sophie. But maybe wait until after dinner to open them." Sophie looked at the packages longingly but nodded. "Okay, can we—" "But who's going to watch Sophie?" Kelly asked, more to herself than to Thomas. "Mrs. Lee can't, and everyone else I know is busy with Christmas." "I can sit with her in the cafeteria," Thomas heard himself offering. "Until you finish your shift." Both Kelly and Sophie looked at him with surprise. "I couldn't ask you to do that," Kelly said. "You've already done so much, and it's Christmas Eve. I'm sure you have plans." Thomas thought about his empty penthouse, the unanswered calls from Walter, the Singapore deal that was probably beyond saving now. "No plans that can't wait," he said. Kelly still looked hesitant. "I don't finish until midnight." "That's fine," Thomas said. "Really?" Sophie looked up at her mother with hopeful eyes. "Please, Mom." "Mr. Thomas has a son, but he lives far away. He shouldn't be alone on Christmas Eve either." Kelly studied Thomas for a long moment, as if trying to understand why a billionaire would want to spend his Christmas Eve in a hospital cafeteria with a 7-year-old girl. Finally, she nodded. "The cafeteria's on the 2nd floor," she said. "I'll come check on you during my breaks." "Mom, can I show Mr. Thomas my drawing before you go back to work?" Sophie asked, pulling the folded napkin from her pocket. as Sophie proudly displayed her Christmas tree drawing to both adults. Thomas realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business meetings or deals. Instead, he was genuinely interested in a child's artwork, drawn on a coffee shop napkin, and somehow, that felt more important than anything else he'd done all day. The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty on Christmas Eve. A few tired doctors and nurses sat scattered at tables, quickly eating before returning to their patients. Holiday music played softly from speakers overhead, creating an odd contrast with the institutional setting. Thomas sat across from Sophie at a corner table. She was coloring on the back of a paper placemat with crayons a kind cafeteria worker had found for her. Mr. Floppy sat propped up against a salt shaker, overseeing her artwork. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked, realizing they'd been here for almost an hour. Sophie nodded without looking up from her drawing. "A little bit." Thomas glanced at the cafeteria's limited offerings. The hot food line was closed, but there was a refrigerated section with pre-made sandwiches, fruit cups, and drinks. "What would you like?" "They have sandwiches, fruit, yogurt." Sophie put down her crayon and thought seriously about this important question. "Do they have chocolate pudding?" Thomas smiled. "Let's go see." They walked together to the food section. Sophie held on to Thomas's hand naturally, as if they'd known each other for years instead of hours. Her small fingers felt warm and trusting in his palm. "Look," she said excitedly. "They do have pudding, and it's the good kind with the whipped cream on top." "Is that your dinner then?" Thomas asked, amused. Sophie looked up at him with a surprisingly serious expression. "Mom says dessert doesn't count as dinner. You have to eat healthy food first, then treats." "Your mom is right," Thomas agreed. "What healthy food would you like?" After careful consideration, Sophie selected a turkey sandwich, apple slices, and milk to go with her chocolate pudding. Thomas chose a similar meal, though it had been years since he'd eaten cafeteria food. His usual dinners involved expensive restaurants or meals prepared by his private chef. When they returned to their table, Sophie arranged their food with great care, making sure everything was placed just so. "We need to say thanks," she informed Thomas, holding out her hands. "Thanks?" Thomas repeated, confused. "For the food," Sophie explained as if it were obvious. "Mom and I always say thanks before we eat." "Oh," Thomas said, awkwardly taking her outstretched hands. "Of course." Sophie bowed her head and closed her eyes tight. "Thank you for this yummy food and for Mr. Thomas helping me today, and for Mom's job at the hospital and for Christmas coming tomorrow. And please help Mrs. Lee's sister feel better. And thank you for pudding." The end. She opened her eyes and smiled at Thomas, who sat stunned by the simple prayer. He couldn't remember the last time he'd expressed gratitude for anything. "Now we can eat," Sophie declared, reaching for her sandwich. As they ate their simple meal, Sophie told Thomas all about her life, her favorite subjects in school, art and science, her best friend Lily, who had moved away last summer, and how she wanted to be a doctor someday to help people feel better. "Mom's saving money so I can go to college," she explained between bites of apple. "She says education is super important." "Do you have a college?" "I went to college, yes," Thomas said. "Many years ago." "Did you study how to build buildings?" "Business," Thomas corrected. "I studied how to make money." Sophie wrinkled her nose. "That doesn't sound as fun as being a doctor." Thomas found himself laughing. "Maybe you're right." As Sophie chatted, Thomas's phone continued to vibrate in his pocket. He'd silenced it, but the constant buzzing was a reminder of the world he'd temporarily left behind. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, he excused himself. "I need to make a quick call," he told Sophie. "Will you be okay here for a minute?" Sophie nodded, already focused on her drawing again. "Mr. Floppy will keep me company." Thomas stepped just outside the cafeteria doors and called Walter. "Thomas." "Thank God," Walter answered immediately. "Where have you been?" "The Singapore deal is—" "I'm not coming in tonight, Walter," Thomas interrupted. "What?" "But the officials are threatening to walk. We need you here." "Give them whatever they want," Thomas said, surprising himself with the words. "The affordable housing units, community center, whatever it takes to close the deal." "Are you serious?" Walter sounded shocked. "That will cut our profits by—" "I know exactly what it will cost," Thomas said firmly. "Do it anyway. And Walter, don't call me again tonight unless the building literally catches fire. I'll be in tomorrow afternoon." He hung up before Walter could protest further and turned off his phone completely. For the first time in decades, business would have to wait. When Thomas returned to the table, Kelly was there, checking on Sophie during her break. "Everything okay?" Kelly asked Thomas, noticing his expression. "Just work," he said. "Nothing important." Kelly looked skeptical but didn't push. "Sophie, are you being good for Mr. Pierce?" "Yes." "We had sandwiches and I showed him my drawing," Sophie said. "Can he come to our apartment when you're done working?" Kelly looked startled. "Sophie, I'm sure Mr. Pierce has his own plans for Christmas Eve. But he said he doesn't." Kelly turned to Thomas with an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry. She doesn't understand." "It's fine," Thomas assured her. "Really?" Kelly checked her watch. "I have to get back. 2 more floors to finish before midnight." After Kelly left, Sophie returned to her drawing, now adding what appeared to be people to her Christmas tree scene. "Is that your family?" Thomas asked, watching her work. Sophie nodded. "That's Mom, and that's me, and that's Mr. Floppy." She pointed to each figure. Then she added another. "And that's you." Thomas felt something catch in his throat. "Me?" "Uh-huh. You're our friend now, friend." Such a simple word. But Thomas couldn't remember the last time someone had called him that. He had business associates, employees, rivals, ex-wives, but friends? Those had disappeared somewhere along his climb to the top. "What's Christmas like at your house?" Sophie asked, adding more decorations to her tree drawing. Thomas considered the question. "Quiet," he finally said. "I usually work. On Christmas?" Sophie looked genuinely shocked. "But what about presents and special breakfast and stuff?" "I don't really celebrate," Thomas admitted. Sophie put down her crayon and stared at him. "That's the saddest thing I ever heard." Coming from a child who couldn't afford a Christmas tree, the statement hit Thomas hard. "Mom and I don't have much money for presents," Sophie continued, "but we always have fun. We make paper chains for decorations and watch Christmas movies. And Mom makes special macaroni and cheese for dinner, the kind with the shaped noodles that look like little trees and stars." "That sounds nice," Thomas said sincerely. "It is," Sophie agreed. Then she looked at him with serious eyes. "Want to have Christmas dinner with me? Mom always makes enough for guests even though nobody ever comes." The question, asked with such innocent directness, broke something open inside Thomas. Suddenly he was remembering Christmases from his childhood. His mother's smile as she handed him a carefully wrapped present. His father teaching him to carve the turkey. The feeling of belonging to something more important than himself. He thought of his son, David, and the excitement on his little face on Christmas mornings long ago. The memory of David asking him to stay home from work to build a snowman, and Thomas saying he was too busy. Always too busy. Until one day David stopped asking. Thomas felt his eyes burn with unexpected tears. He tried to blink them away, but they came faster than he could control. He covered his face with his hands, embarrassed but unable to stop the sudden flood of emotions. "Mr. Thomas?" Sophie's worried voice came from across the table. "Are you okay? Did I say something wrong?" Thomas shook his head, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. How could he explain to this child that her simple invitation had pierced through decades of isolation and regret? That the thought of being welcomed into their home, with its paper decorations and shaped macaroni, felt more valuable? Thomas had no answer for that. His tree was decorated in company colors with matching ornaments. There was nothing personal about it at all. "I have a car coming to take us to your mom," he said instead. "It should be here soon." Sophie folded her drawing and put it in her pocket. "Thank you for helping me, Mr. Thomas." "You're welcome, Sophie." As they waited for the car, Thomas found himself wondering what Walter and the legal team were doing. The Singapore deal was probably collapsing right now. Strangely, as he sat in the warm coffee shop watching Sophie swing her legs back and forth on the too-tall chair, he found it hard to care. The sleek black town car pulled up outside the coffee shop just as the snow started falling even harder. The driver, bundled in a heavy coat, rushed in with an umbrella. "Mr. Pierce?" he asked, scanning the room until he spotted Thomas sitting with Sophie. "That's us," Thomas said, standing up. "Thank you for coming out in this weather." "Of course, sir," the driver said, though his expression changed to confusion when he saw Sophie. Thomas Pierce, notorious workaholic and demanding boss, was spending Christmas Eve helping a little girl in a worn pink coat. "Is that our taxi?" Sophie asked, clutching Mr. Floppy. "Something like that," Thomas replied. He turned to the barista. "Thank you for your help." "No problem," she said with a smile. "Merry Christmas." Thomas helped Sophie with her coat and made sure she was still wrapped in his cashmere scarf. The driver held the umbrella over them as they walked to the car. Sophie's eyes widened when she saw the vehicle. Wow, it's so fancy. Like a princess car. Thomas couldn't help but smile as he helped her inside. The leather seats, wood trim, and privacy partition probably did seem like luxury fit for royalty to a 7-year-old girl. Central Memorial Hospital. Thomas instructed the driver as they settled in. Sophie bounced slightly on the soft leather seat. "This is so cool," she whispered to her rabbit before looking up at Thomas. "Do you always ride in cars like this?" "Usually," Thomas admitted, suddenly aware of how extravagant his daily life would seem to someone like Sophie. "Mom and I take the bus," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes when it's raining really hard, we take a taxi, but only if Mom has extra money that week." As the car pulled away from the curb, Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. He turned it back on out of habit. 14 missed calls and 27 text messages. The Singapore deal was undoubtedly falling apart. Sophie was pressing her face against the window, watching the snow-covered streets pass by. "Look, Mr. Floppy," she said to her rabbit. "The whole city looks like it's covered in frosting." Thomas put his phone away without checking the messages. For some reason, they seemed less important now. "Do you live in a big house?" Sophie asked, turning her attention back to him. "I live in an apartment," Thomas replied, "but it's at the very top of a tall building. Can you see the whole city from up there?" "Yes, you can see for miles on a clear day," Sophie nodded appreciatively. "That must be nice. We're on the 3rd floor and all I can see is the brick wall of the building next door." Thomas thought of his penthouse with its panoramic views, designer furniture, and empty rooms. Somehow, it didn't seem as impressive when described to a child who found wonder in a car ride. "Do you have kids?" Sophie asked suddenly. The question caught Thomas off guard. "I have a son. He's grown up now." "Does he live with you?" "No," Thomas said quietly. "He lives far away." "Oh," Sophie said. "That's sad. Don't you miss him?" Thomas stared out the window watching the snow fall. "Yes," he finally said. "I miss him very much." "Then you should call him," Sophie suggested, as if it were the simplest solution in the world. "Mom says that's what phones are for, to talk to people you miss." "It's not that easy," Thomas tried to explain. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated relationships." Sophie looked puzzled. "Why, did you have a fight?" "Sort of," Thomas admitted. "I missed some important moments in his life because I was working too much." "Well, you could say sorry," Sophie suggested. "Mom says a real sorry can fix lots of things." Thomas smiled sadly. "Your mom sounds very wise." "She is," Sophie agreed proudly. "She knows everything. Well, except how to fix our toaster. It only burns the bread now, so we have to scrape it with a knife every morning." The car slowed as they approached the hospital. Central Memorial was an imposing structure, with its blue-lit sign glowing through the falling snow. The emergency room entrance was busy with ambulances and people hurrying in and out despite the weather and holiday. "We're here," the driver announced, pulling up to the main entrance. Thomas turned to Sophie. "Ready to see your mom?" Sophie nodded eagerly. "She's going to be so surprised." They made their way into the busy hospital lobby. The stark fluorescent lighting was a harsh contrast to the soft glow of the coffee shop. People in various states of distress filled the waiting area, a reminder that illness and injury didn't take holidays. Thomas approached the information desk, holding Sophie's hand. "We're looking for Kelly Reynolds. She works here as a nurse's aide. Her daughter needs to see her," the receptionist typed on her computer. "5th floor, East Wing," she said. "But staff aren't supposed to have visitors during shifts." "It's an emergency," Thomas said firmly. Her daughter's babysitter had to leave unexpectedly. The receptionist looked at Sophie, who smiled hopefully. "5th floor," she repeated with a sigh. "Take the elevators on the right." As they rode up in the elevator, Sophie held Thomas's hand tightly. "Hospitals smell funny," she observed. "They do," Thomas agreed. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been in a hospital. Probably when his mother died 5 years ago. Even then, he'd arrived too late to say goodbye. The elevator doors opened onto a busy hospital floor. Nurses and staff hurried back and forth, pushing carts and checking charts. Holiday decorations hung alongside medical posters, a strange mix of festivity and clinical sterility. "Do you know where your mom works?" Thomas asked. "This way," Sophie said confidently, pulling him down the hallway. "I've been here before when Mom couldn't find a babysitter." They passed patient rooms and supply closets, Some rooms had small Christmas decorations or cards taped to the doors. In one room, an elderly patient sat alone watching the snow fall outside his window. "That's sad," Sophie whispered, noticing the man too. Nobody should be alone on Christmas Eve. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, thinking of his own solitary plans for the evening. "Mom," Sophie suddenly called out, dropping Thomas's hand and running toward a young woman in light blue scrubs pushing a linen cart. Kelly Reynolds turned around just in time to catch her daughter in a tight hug. "Sophie, oh my goodness, what are you doing here?" She knelt down, checking Sophie over as if making sure she was really okay. "I got lost trying to find you, but then Mr. Thomas helped me," Sophie explained excitedly. "We had hot chocolate and we rode in a fancy car and he let me use his scarf." Kelly looked up, noticing Thomas for the first time. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in his expensive coat and the obvious contrast between them. She stood up, keeping one arm protectively around Sophie. "Thank you for helping my daughter," she said, her voice a mix of gratitude and caution. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need," Thomas said, suddenly feeling awkward in the fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway. "I'm just glad she's safe." Kelly was young, probably in her early 30s, with the same curly dark hair as Sophie. Despite her obvious exhaustion, there was a strength in her eyes that Thomas immediately respected. "Sophie said Mrs. Lee had an emergency?" Kelly asked, looking concerned. "That's what she told me," Thomas confirmed. "I found Sophie in Anderson Park trying to find her way here." Kelly hugged Sophie tighter. "You know you're never supposed to go off by yourself. Anything could have happened." "I'm sorry, Mom," Sophie said, looking down. "I just wanted to see you." Kelly sighed, her anger quickly melting into relief. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe, that's what matters." She looked back at Thomas. "And thank you, Mr. E. Pierce," he supplied. "Thomas Pierce." A flash of recognition crossed Kelly's face. "Pierce, as in Pierce Enterprises? The real estate company?" Thomas nodded, surprised. Most people recognized his name from business news or society pages, but he wouldn't have expected a hospital aide to make the connection. "Your company owns this building," Kelly said, "and the apartment complex where we live." Now it was Thomas's turn to be surprised. He owned hundreds of properties across the city, including several apartment buildings that provided workforce housing. He rarely thought about the actual people who lived in them. "Mom, can Mr. Thomas stay and talk? He's really nice," Sophie said, still wrapped in his cashmere scarf. Kelly checked her watch with a worried expression. "Honey, I have to get back to work. I'm already behind on my rounds and Mrs. Garcia needs her room cleaned before the doctor visits." "I've kept you long enough," Thomas said quickly. "I should be going as well." Though he had nowhere to be now that he'd missed the Singapore meeting. "How long were you planning to sit here?" Thomas asked, still standing a careful distance away. "Until I figured out which way the hospital is," Sophie said. She held up her stuffed rabbit to her ear like she was listening to it. "Mr. Floppy thinks it's that way, but I think it's that way." She pointed in two opposite directions. Thomas glanced at his watch again. The meeting was starting in 15 minutes. "The hospital is actually that way," he said, pointing to his right. "But it's too far to walk in this snow, especially for someone your age." "I'm 7.5, Sophie said proudly. "That's pretty big." Despite himself, Thomas felt a small smile form. 7.5 is pretty big, but that's still a long walk in a snowstorm. His phone buzzed again. Walter was calling now. Thomas should answer it. He should tell this child to stay put while he called the proper authorities. He should get to his meeting and save the Singapore deal. Instead, he silenced his phone and put it back in his pocket. "Tell you what," he said, making a decision that surprised even him. "Let's get you somewhere warm while we figure out how to find your mom." Sophie looked at him suspiciously. "Mom says I shouldn't go with strangers." "Your mom is absolutely right," Thomas said, respecting her caution. "How about this? There's a coffee shop just outside the park. We can go there and you can use their phone to call your mom. You'll be around lots of other people, so it's safe." Sophie considered this, looking at her rabbit as if asking for advice. "Mr. Floppy thinks that's okay. But I don't know Mom's number. It's in my phone, but Mrs. Lee has my backpack with my phone." Thomas rubbed his hand over his face. This was getting complicated. "Do you know where your mom works? Which hospital?" "The big one with the blue sign," Sophie said. She cleans rooms and helps the nurses. Central Memorial, Thomas said. It was the largest hospital in the city, about 15 blocks from where they were. Another gust of wind brought more snow, and Sophie tucked her rabbit inside her coat. Her lips were starting to look slightly blue. Thomas knew he needed to get her warm regardless of his meeting. "Here," he said, taking off his cashmere scarf and holding it out to her. "Wrap this around your neck." Sophie eyed the offering. "It looks expensive." "It's just a scarf," Thomas said, though it had probably cost more than what her mother made in a day. Sophie took it and wrapped it around her neck. The gray cashmere nearly swallowed her small face, but at least it would keep her warm. "Come on," Thomas said. "Let's get to that coffee shop." Sophie hopped off the bench, landing in snow that came up past her ankles. As they started walking, Thomas noticed her limping slightly. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "My boots are too small," Sophie explained simply. "Mom says I grow like a weed." Thomas looked down at her worn boots, now soaked with snow. Without thinking, he reached down and picked her up. She was startlingly light. "Hey," Sophie protested. "It's faster this way," Thomas explained, "and your feet won't get wetter." Sophie seemed unsure but didn't struggle. "You're strong for an old man." Thomas nearly laughed. "I'm only 52. "That's ancient," Sophie said with the brutal honesty only children possess. As he carried her through the park, Thomas realized it had been years, maybe decades, since he'd had such direct human contact. No handshakes or polite shoulder touches could compare to carrying a child. It felt strange and yet somehow familiar, like remembering a language he once knew. The coffee shop was warm and crowded with last-minute Christmas shoppers taking refuge from the storm. Heads turned when Thomas entered carrying Sophie. He suddenly realized how they must look. A well-dressed businessman carrying a little girl in a worn pink coat. "My young friend here got lost in the park," he explained to the curious barista as he set Sophie down on a chair near the counter. "Can we use your phone to call her mother?" "Of course," the barista said, reaching under the counter for a phone. "Poor thing must be freezing." "Can I get a hot chocolate too?" Sophie asked, looking at the menu board. "With whipped cream?" "I don't think," Thomas began, but the barista interrupted. "On the house," she said with a smile. "It's Christmas Eve." Thomas nodded his thanks and turned to Sophie. "While they make your hot chocolate, let's try to call the hospital." He dialed the number for Central Memorial and navigated the automated system. After a few minutes of being transferred, he reached someone in human resources. "I'm trying to reach an employee," he explained. "Her daughter is with me. She got separated from her babysitter." "What's the employee's name?" the voice asked. Thomas looked at Sophie. "What's your mom's name?" "Kelly Reynolds," Sophie said. "She works on the 5th floor." After several more minutes of being passed around the hospital's phone system, they finally located Kelly. She was nearly frantic when she got on the phone. "Sophie, where are you?" Mrs. Lee called and said you were missing. Thomas took the phone. "Ms. Reynolds, my name is Thomas Pierce. I found your daughter in Anderson Park. She was trying to find her way to the hospital. She's safe now. We're at the coffee corner on 8th Street. There was a pause. "Who are you?" Kelly asked, suspicion evident in her voice. "Just someone who was passing through the park," Thomas said. "Your daughter is fine, just a bit cold. She's having hot chocolate now." "I can't leave work," Kelly said, her voice tight with worry. "We're short-staffed, and I've already been warned about taking time off. I don't get off until midnight." Thomas checked his watch again. His meeting had started 5 minutes ago. The Singapore deal was likely falling apart without him there to negotiate. He should call Walter, explain the situation, and have someone come pick up Sophie. Instead, he heard himself say, "I can bring her to you at the hospital." "You don't have to do that," Kelly said quickly. "I can call my neighbor." "It's no trouble," Thomas said. "It's Christmas Eve. I'm happy to help." After getting Kelly's permission, and more specific details about where to meet her, Thomas hung up. He turned to find Sophie with a whipped cream mustache and a cookie that the barista had apparently also given her on the house. "Your mom is working until midnight," Thomas told her. I told her I'd bring you to the hospital so you could see her. Sophie nodded, taking another bite of her cookie. She always works on Christmas Eve. The regular people get to stay home with their families, so Mom fills in. She gets extra money. Thomas felt an unexpected pang at her matter-of-fact explanation. While he chose to work on Christmas Eve, Sophie's mother had no choice. His phone buzzed yet again. He pulled it out to see multiple missed calls and messages from Walter and other executives. The most recent text from Walter read, "Officials walking out. Need you here now." Thomas stared at his phone, then looked at Sophie, who was carefully breaking her cookie in half to share with her rabbit. "Mr. Floppy says thank you for helping me," she said, offering the rabbit's half of the cookie to Thomas. "He wants to know what your job is. Are you a policeman?" Thomas took the cookie piece, oddly touched by the gesture. "No, I'm a businessman. I own buildings." "Like houses?" "Bigger buildings. Office buildings, hotels, shopping centers." Sophie's eyes widened. "Wow. Do you own the toy store downtown? The one with the giant teddy bear in the window?" "No, but I own the building it's in," Thomas replied. "That's cool," Sophie said, clearly impressed. "Mom says I can get one toy after Christmas when they go on sale. I want a doctor kit because I'm going to be a doctor someday." Thomas looked at his phone again, then turned it off completely. "Finish your hot chocolate," he said. "Then we'll go see your mom." While Sophie sipped her drink, Thomas approached the counter. "Can you call a car service? We need to get to Central Memorial Hospital." "In this weather? Good luck," the barista said. "Taxis aren't running with the snow this heavy and rideshare apps are showing hour-long waits." Thomas frowned. The hospital was too far to walk, especially with a child in ill-fitting boots. "I have an idea," he said, turning back to Sophie. "Wait here for a minute." He stepped outside the coffee shop and made a call, not to Walter or his legal team, but to Nancy, his assistant. "Mr. Pierce?" she answered, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "Nancy, I need a favor," he said. "I know it's Christmas Eve and you're with your family, but I need you to send a car to Coffee Corner on 8th Street. I need to get to Central Memorial Hospital." "Are you hurt?" Nancy asked, concerned. "No, nothing like that. I found a lost child, and I need to get her to her mother who works at the hospital." There was a pause, and Thomas could imagine Nancy's shock at this unexpected development. "Of course, Mr. Pierce, I'll have a car there in 10 minutes. "Thank you, Nancy. And Merry Christmas." When Thomas returned to the coffee shop, Sophie had finished her hot chocolate and was drawing on a napkin with a pen the barista had given her. "What are you drawing?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "It's a Christmas tree," Sophie said. "We don't have one this year because Mom said they cost too much money, but we made paper ornaments to hang on the wall." She held up her drawing proudly. "See? This one is Mr. Floppy." Thomas looked at the simple drawing, a triangle with circles and stars, and what might have been a rabbit hanging from one of the branches. "It's very good," he said. "I have a Christmas tree in my office, but I didn't decorate it myself." "Then how do you know it has all your favorite things on it?" Sophie asked, as if this was the entire point of a Christmas tree. The snow fell softly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Thomas Pierce's office on the top floor of the Pierce Tower, 52 stories above the busy streets of New York. Thomas sat alone at his desk, watching the white flakes dance in the wind as the city below prepared for Christmas. It was Christmas Eve, but in his office it might as well have been any other workday. Thomas loosened his tie and leaned back in his custom leather chair. At 52 years old, he had built an empire worth billions. Pierce Enterprises owned buildings in 37 countries, employed over 10,000 people, and made more money in a day than most people would see in their lifetime. The business magazines called him brilliant. His competitors called him ruthless. Few people called him a friend. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of the heating system. His assistant, Nancy, had left hours ago to spend Christmas Eve with her family, leaving behind a stack of papers on the corner of his desk. They were requests for donations, children's hospitals, homeless shelters, food banks, all hoping for a piece of the Pierce fortune. Thomas knew his accountants would handle them after the holidays. They were good tax write-offs, nothing more. He picked up one letter, decorated with children's handprints, and read the first line before setting it back down with a sigh. The cheerful red and green handprints made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. "Another Christmas alone," he said to the empty room, his voice sounding strange in the silence. The truth was, Thomas Pierce had forgotten how to be around people unless he was giving them orders or negotiating a deal. 20 years of putting business first had built his wealth, but had cost him everything else. His marriage had ended 12 years ago, when his wife Lisa finally gave up trying to compete with his work. She had remarried a dentist 5 years later, a man who apparently knew how to come home for dinner. Their son, David, had stopped talking to Thomas after his college graduation. Thomas had missed the ceremony because of an emergency meeting in Tokyo. He had sent an expensive watch as a gift. David had sent it back with a note that simply read, "You can't buy time." Thomas still had the watch in his desk drawer. He'd never worn it. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Walter, his head of international development. "I'm sorry to bother you on Christmas Eve, sir, but we have a problem with the Singapore deal. The local officials are backing out unless we agree to their new terms." Thomas felt a familiar tension building behind his eyes. "What new terms?" "They want us to include affordable housing in the development. 20% of the units at below market rates. It would cut our profits by millions." Thomas stood up and walked to the window, watching the snow fall harder now, covering the city in white. "Absolutely not. Get the legal team together. I'll be there in 30 minutes. He hung up without waiting for an answer. The Singapore project was too important to fail. It would be the tallest building in Southeast Asia with his name on it, another monument to his success. Thomas grabbed his coat, a custom-made cashmere overcoat that cost more than what many people earned in a month. His reflection in the window looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than he remembered. When had his hair turned so gray? He couldn't recall the last time he had really looked at himself. The office Christmas party had been held last week in the company dining hall. Thomas had made his usual appearance, given his usual speech about record profits and bright futures, then disappeared back to his office while everyone else celebrated. Nancy had brought him a plate of food later, which he had barely touched. As he buttoned his coat, Thomas glanced at the small, artificial Christmas tree Nancy had insisted on placing in the corner of his office. It was tastefully decorated with silver and blue ornaments, the company colors. No personal touches, no homemade decorations, nothing that would suggest a life outside these walls. His penthouse apartment would be the same, professionally decorated for the season with perfect, impersonal holiday touches. The cleaning staff would have turned on the timer for the lights. The refrigerator would be stocked with food he wouldn't eat. Everything would be in order, clean, perfect, and empty. Thomas stepped into his private elevator, swiping his keycard for the express ride down. As the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirrored wall. Expensive suit, perfect haircut, cold eyes. He looked away. The building was nearly empty, most employees having left early for Christmas Eve celebrations. The security guard at the lobby desk nodded respectfully as Thomas passed, probably wondering why the billionaire owner was working while everyone else was home with their families. "Merry Christmas." "Mr. Pierce," the guard called. "Yes, thank you," Thomas replied without slowing his pace or turning around. He pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the cold December night. The snow was coming down heavily now, large flakes melting on his coat as he walked. His driver had the night off. Thomas had insisted, thinking he would spend the evening in his office anyway. Now he would have to walk the 6 blocks to the company's legal offices, or try to find a taxi on Christmas Eve in a snowstorm. Thomas pulled his collar higher against the wind and decided to cut through the city park. It would save him 10 minutes, and the legal team was waiting. The park was beautiful in the snow, the trees outlined in white, the lamps casting yellow pools of light on the fresh powder. Under different circumstances, he might have found it peaceful. As he walked, his mind was already working on the Singapore problem, calculating losses and planning strategies. He barely noticed the few other people hurrying through the park, all eager to get home to their families. Thomas checked his watch, an ultra-thin Swiss timepiece worth more than a car, and quickened his pace. The snow was getting deeper, slowing him down despite his expensive leather shoes. He should have called for a car service. Another poor decision in a long line of them. His thoughts drifted to his son. David would be 32 now. Was he married? Did Thomas have grandchildren he'd never met? The last he'd heard, David was working for an environmental nonprofit in Seattle, about as far from his father's business philosophy as he could get. Thomas's parents had died within a year of each other, his father first from a heart attack, then his mother from what the doctors called natural causes, but what Thomas suspected was a broken heart. He had been too busy to visit them much in their final years. Another regret in a life full of them. The wind picked up, blowing snow into his face. Thomas lowered his head and pressed forward. He was so focused on his thoughts that he almost missed the small figure sitting alone on a park bench ahead, partially hidden by the falling snow. Something made him slow his steps. The figure was small, a child huddled on the bench wearing a pink coat that looked too thin for the weather. A little girl sitting alone in a park during a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. Thomas's first instinct was to keep walking. Whatever the situation was, it wasn't his problem. He was already late for his meeting. The Singapore deal was worth hundreds of millions. Someone else would come along, someone better equipped to handle a lost child, but no one else was around. The park had emptied as the storm worsened. Thomas checked his watch again and frowned. He took a few more steps past the bench, then stopped. With a sigh that formed a cloud in the cold air, he turned back. The little girl looked up as he approached, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit to her chest. She had dark curly hair poking out from under a knitted hat, and her cheeks were red from the cold. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, staying a respectful distance away. "Where are your parents?" The girl studied him with serious eyes. "My mom's at work. She's a nurse helper at the big hospital." Thomas glanced around the empty park. "You're here by yourself?" She nodded. "Mrs. Lee was supposed to watch me, but her sister got sick, so she had to leave. I was trying to find my mom at the hospital, but I think I went the wrong way." Thomas pulled out his phone, ready to call the police. This was their job, not his. He had a meeting to get to, a deal to save. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked, noticing how the snow had piled up on the bench beside her. "I don't know. My feet got tired from walking." She looked down at her boots, which Thomas now noticed were worn and possibly too small. "Are you lost too?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. "No, I'm not lost." "You look lost," she said simply. Thomas stared at the child, not knowing how to respond. His phone buzzed in his hand, probably Walter wondering where he was. The Singapore deal was waiting. His legacy was waiting. But somehow standing in the snow on Christmas Eve, looking at a lost little girl with a tattered rabbit, Thomas Pierce couldn't make himself turn away. He put his phone back in his pocket without checking the message. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said, hugging her rabbit closer. "This is Mr. Floppy." For the first time in what felt like years, Thomas felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Nice to meet you both. I'm Thomas. How about I help you find your mom?" Sophie shivered slightly as another gust of wind blew through the park. Thomas noticed her thin pink coat wasn't doing much to keep out the cold.